There are moments in life when a single glance becomes the spark that ignites a storm no one sees coming. That is exactly what happened when a quiet, rough-edged biker locked eyes with the daughter of a police officer on an ordinary afternoon that should have meant nothing. But something in that brief exchange, something soft, something unspoken, set off a chain of events that neither of them could stop. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, more than 200 bikers stood in complete silence around a police station, creating a scene so powerful that the entire town would remember it for decades. Everything began with a love that wasn't supposed to exist, a love born between two worlds that traditionally collided like fire and gasoline. He came from the open road, where loyalty was everything, and your word mattered more than any badge. She came from a world governed by rules, structure, and expectations she never chose. Yet when their paths crossed, both felt that unmistakable pull, that quiet recognition that goes deeper than logic and louder than fear. And in that moment, they knew life would not be the same. But love, especially the kind that defies boundaries, has a way of waking up old rivalries and stirring dangerous suspicions. When her father discovered the truth, it didn't matter that the biker had done nothing wrong. All he could see was a threat standing too close to his daughter. And in a town where tensions already simmered just beneath the surface, one misunderstanding was enough to turn a simple act of affection into an accusation that spread faster than wildfire. What no one expected, not even the biker himself, was what happened next. Word traveled through the highways, carried by loyalty stronger than fear. One rider made a call, then another, and by dawn, engines began rumbling from miles away. They didn't come to intimidate, and they didn't come to fight. They came for something deeper, something the town would not understand until it was standing right in front of them. And so, as the first light of morning crept over the quiet streets, the officers inside the station stepped outside to a sight they could hardly believe. More than 200 bikers formed a silent circle around the building, engines off, helmets under their arms, hearts steady. No yelling. No threats, just a message spoken without a single word. A message that would reveal a truth no one expected, and a story that would change everything from that day forward. The silence that surrounded the station that morning carried a weight far heavier than any confrontation could have created. Officers inside felt at first a strange, humbling pressure that came not from the threat of violence, but from the undeniable sense of unity standing outside their doors. These were men who had spent years battling stereotypes attached to bikers, yet the sight before them challenged everything they thought they knew. 200 riders, shoulder to shoulder, united by nothing more than loyalty and an unspoken promise to protect one of their own, even if he hadn't asked for it. That contrast alone unsettled the room, creating a tension that hovered between fear and awe. Inside one of the interrogation rooms, the young biker sat with his hands on the cold table, not in cuffs, but waiting for someone to believe him, waiting for the truth to matter. His thoughts drifted back to the evening before, to the soft laughter of the officer's daughter as they shared stories under the dim glow of a streetlight. Nothing about that moment had felt dangerous. Nothing about it hinted that by sunrise he would become a suspect, a problem, an inconvenience to a man who couldn't imagine his daughter falling for someone outside his carefully controlled world. Even now, he could still feel the warmth of that moment and the bitterness of how quickly it had been taken from him. Meanwhile, the girl stood on the other side of the station doors, pacing anxiously as she tried to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. She had begged her father to listen, to see the truth, but words seemed to crumble the moment they left her mouth. It wasn't just about protecting her. It was about protecting a worldview he had guarded for decades. A worldview where bikers caused trouble, and trouble never belonged near his family. Yet as she watched the massive circle of riders hold their silent ground, something inside her shifted. She realized she wasn't alone in fighting for what she felt. This was bigger than a misunderstanding. It was a message about respect, loyalty, and the kind of love that refuses to be silenced. The officer, however, stood torn between duty and fear. He saw the bikers not as protectors, but as a threat, a looming wall of engines and leather jackets capable of turning his quiet town upside down. In his mind, This wasn't about his daughter's emotions, but about control slipping through his fingers. Yet something about the silence unnerved him. If these men had come for violence, they would not be standing so still. If they had come to intimidate, they would not be meeting his gaze with calm, unwavering eyes. The truth was simple, but he wasn't ready to admit it. They weren't there to fight him. They were there because their loyalty to the young biker was deeper than his assumptions. Still, beneath the tension, an undeniable truth began to form. This was not a gathering of rebels seeking revenge, but a circle of brothers refusing to let one of their own be swallowed by prejudice. And as the minutes passed, the entire town began to realize something profound. This was not just about love or misunderstanding. It was about the power of a community that stood together, silently declaring that loyalty can be peaceful, strength can be gentle, and sometimes the loudest message is delivered without a single word spoken. By mid-morning, curious residents began gathering behind the police line, whispering as they watched the scene unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. Many of them had grown up hearing stories about bikers as outlaws, troublemakers, or shadows that moved through highways without routes or rules. But what they were witnessing now didn't match those stories at all. These riders stood in neat formation, helmets at their sides, heads slightly bowed, as though honoring something sacred. The contrast between rumor and reality stirred a quiet fascination in the crowd, making them question everything they thought they understood about the world beyond their familiar small-town boundaries. Inside the station, debates erupted among the officers as they tried to interpret the bikers' intentions. Some feared that the silence was merely a facade masking something more dangerous, while others sensed a strange dignity in their stance. It was rare to see that many men united in peaceful solidarity, especially when the world expected them to be violent. The longer the riders remained motionless, the more their presence disrupted the assumptions held within the building. The officers who had once judged the biker sitting in the interrogation room now found themselves studying him differently, noticing his calm posture and the absence of hostility in his eyes. Meanwhile, the girl stepped outside, unable to stand still any longer. When she approached the line of bikers, they parted just enough to let her pass, their expressions softening as they recognized the reason they were all there. She felt their support like a wave, a reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. As she walked toward the nearest officer, a quiet determination filled her chest. She knew the truth, and she knew her father was wrong. The question wasn't whether she could convince him. It was whether he was willing to see beyond his own fears long enough to understand the reality in front of him. Her father watched her from a distance, torn between protective instinct and mounting doubt. Every time he looked at the young biker, he saw a threat. But every time he looked at his daughter, he saw fear, heartbreak, and a determination he didn't recognize. These contradictions collided inside him, creating an internal war he struggled to control. He wanted to believe he had acted correctly, yet the silent force gathered outside told a different story, a story where he was the one drawing conclusions too quickly, allowing old stereotypes to blind him to the truth. As the tension reached its peak, an unexpected shift occurred. One of the older bikers, a man with gray streaks in his beard and eyes that carried decades of road-worn wisdom, stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show aggression. Instead, he simply removed his gloves and folded them gently in his hands, a gesture so calm and respectful that even the officers felt compelled to pause. Something about him radiated authority, not the kind enforced by a badge, but the kind earned through years of loyalty, hardship, and brotherhood. And in that quiet moment, the story took a turn no one saw coming. The older biker's quiet approach shifted the entire atmosphere, as though the air itself grew still out of respect. Officers straightened unconsciously, citizens leaned forward, and even the biker sitting inside felt the weight of the moment settling over the station. This man was not just another rider. He carried the presence of someone who had lived through battles, heartbreaks, and roads that tested the limits of the human spirit. When he stopped at the edge of the police line, he lifted his gaze and locked eyes with the officer in charge, the father. No challenge, no hostility, just a calm, grounded truth that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. With slow, deliberate steps, he extended his folded gloves to one of the officers, a symbolic gesture that carried decades of meaning. Among riders, gloves removed and offered forward meant surrender, not to power, but to understanding. It was a statement that said, "We came without violence, and we seek only justice." The gesture disarmed the officers not because it weakened the bikers' position, but because it elevated the moral weight of their cause. There was a purity in that silence, a sincerity that even the father couldn't ignore. This was not the behavior of criminals. This was the behavior of men who valued loyalty more deeply than pride. Inside the station, the young biker felt a knot tighten in his chest. He recognized the gesture even without seeing it. He knew the older man would only do that if the situation called for honesty and dignity above ego. It meant the Brotherhood had not come to pressure anyone, but to stand as witnesses to the truth. That realization filled him with both pride and guilt. Pride because he belonged to something honorable. Guilt because he never wanted the woman he cared for to face this kind of turmoil on his account. The weight of being misunderstood pressed heavily on him, but so did the hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment could change everything. The officer's daughter watched the scene unfold with a mix of relief and fear. Relief because the biker's peaceful stance validated everything she had been trying to tell her father. Fear because she knew how stubborn he could be when confronted with anything that challenged his authority. Yet as she watched the older man's gesture, simple, silent, noble, she felt something shift inside her father's stern expression. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was doubt, and for the first time since the chaos began, she saw the hardened lines of his judgment begin to soften around the edges. And as the silence continued, something remarkable began to happen. The townspeople, who had arrived expecting tension or conflict, now looked at the bikers with hesitant admiration. The narrative that had lived in their minds, the one that painted riders as reckless or dangerous, cracked under the weight of what they were witnessing. People whispered, exchanged glances, and slowly realized that this was not just a display of loyalty. It was a lesson in humility, courage, and the power of standing for truth even when the world assumes the worst. And that shift in perspective, though subtle at first, would soon grow into something much larger. As the sun climbed higher, its warm light cut across the silent circle of riders, casting long shadows that stretched toward the station like an unspoken bridge between two divided worlds. The older biker remained at the front, his posture steady and unwavering. Every rider behind him mirrored that quiet resolve, creating a united front that radiated an unmistakable message. They were not leaving until fairness prevailed. The stillness was so profound that even passing cars slowed down, drivers leaning out of their windows in disbelief as they witnessed a scene more powerful than any words could describe. Inside the station, the father paced back and forth, gripping his belt as frustration and confusion battled inside him. For years, his instincts had guided every decision, instincts honed by danger, deception, and a lifetime of protecting the people he loved. But now those instincts felt unreliable, clouded by prejudice he hadn't realized he carried. The presence of 200 peaceful bikers outside challenged him in ways no criminal ever had. They weren't fighting him. They were holding him accountable. And that realization forced him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. Maybe he wasn't protecting his daughter. Maybe he was protecting his pride. The young biker, still seated in the interrogation room, felt the tension thickening with every passing minute. He knew the officers were watching him differently now, studying the sincerity in his answers and the calmness in his demeanor. He spoke with honesty, explaining what had happened with the officer's daughter, clarifying that there had been no disrespect, no hidden agenda, no harm. His voice remained steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he knew the truth had nothing to fear. And as the officers listened, their skepticism began to fade, replaced by curiosity and a slowly growing understanding. Outside, the girl stepped toward the older biker, her voice trembling slightly as she thanked him for standing by the man she cared about. He simply nodded, acknowledging her gratitude without taking credit. To him, loyalty wasn't a grand gesture. It was a way of life, woven into the very identity of every rider who stood behind him. In that moment, she understood something profound. These men weren't dangerous because they rode motorcycles or wore leather. They were dangerous only to those who mistook their silence for weakness, to those who misjudged the depth of their loyalty. And the world often fears what it doesn't understand. As the tension slowly dissolved into contemplation, a quiet shift swept through the crowd. The riders stood taller. The officers watched more closely. The townspeople leaned in, as though sensing that the next few moments would determine everything. And somewhere deep inside the father, a small but undeniable truth began to take root. The young biker might not be the threat he feared. Perhaps the real danger was allowing his judgment to harden before he even listened. And with that fragile realization flickering to life, the story moved one step closer to the turning point none of them expected, a moment that would either heal the divide or deepen it forever. As the hours passed, the quiet resolve of the bikers began to press on the conscience of everyone inside the station. It wasn't aggression that made their presence impossible to ignore. It was their unwavering discipline. No raised voices, no hostile gestures, just steady breathing, patient silence, and the unbreakable unity of a brotherhood that refused to abandon someone they believed in. That silence acted like a mirror, forcing the officers to reflect on the weight of their decisions, especially the father, whose authority now felt less like a shield and more like a barrier he had built to protect himself from uncomfortable truths. Inside the interrogation room, the young biker's calmness began winning over officers who had entered skeptical. They asked questions, expecting cracks in his story, but found only clarity and sincerity. Every detail aligned. Every answer carried the same respectful steadiness. He never once raised his voice or tried to shift blame. He simply told the truth, plain and unembellished. And with each passing minute, the officers found themselves questioning why they had assumed guilt before proof, why they had let old narratives fill in the blanks that reality had not. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, outside, the girl watched her father from a distance as he stood behind the glass window, overlooking the bikers. His expression had softened, but she could see the internal struggle etched into every line of his face. She understood the weight of his worry, the fear of losing control, of failing to protect her. But she also understood that love cannot be guarded behind locked doors or enforced with suspicion. She took a slow breath, summoning the courage to confront him again, not with anger, but with hope. She needed him to see her heart clearly, even if it meant challenging the walls he had built around his own. When she finally approached him, her voice trembled not from fear, but from the emotion of the moment. She told him she trusted the young biker, not because she was naive, but because she had seen who he truly was: gentle, honest, respectful. She reminded her father that love doesn't always arrive in the form we expect, and sometimes the people who look the roughest carry the kindest souls. Her words broke something loose inside him, a tension he had held for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let go. He didn't answer her immediately, but the silence between them finally felt open instead of closed. Outside, the older biker watched the father through the station window, sensing the shift even without hearing their conversation. Years of navigating conflict had taught him how to read the subtle signs: the softened shoulders, the distant gaze, the troubled exhale of a man reconsidering everything he thought he knew. He hoped the father would choose understanding over fear, truth over pride. For the Brotherhood, this wasn't about winning a fight. It was about honoring a young man who had done nothing wrong and protecting the fragile, unexpected connection that had grown between him and the girl. The moment of truth was approaching, carried on the quiet hope that compassion would finally replace judgment. The station's atmosphere shifted noticeably when the father requested to speak with the young biker alone. Officers exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the moment, while the girl held her breath, as if the entire outcome of the day hinged on that single conversation. The father walked into the room with a solemn expression, no longer fueled by anger or suspicion, but by a heavy mix of regret and uncertainty. For the first time since the ordeal began, he didn't see a stereotype sitting across the table. He saw a young man caught in the storm of someone else's fear. The biker met his gaze calmly, his posture steady even as tension thickened in the air. He didn't rush to defend himself or recite explanations. He simply waited, allowing the father the space to speak first. That quiet respect was unexpected, and it softened the officer's demeanor even more. When the father finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost hesitant, as he asked questions that held more vulnerability than authority. Questions about intentions, respect, boundaries, and the truth of what had happened. And the biker answered with the same genuine honesty he had shown from the beginning. As the conversation unfolded, the father found his assumptions unraveling. The biker's words were grounded and sincere, shaped not by fear, but by integrity. He spoke of loyalty, of protecting the people he cared about, of wanting a chance to prove that appearances didn't define his character. And beneath every sentence lay a truth the father could no longer deny. This young man cared deeply for his daughter, not out of rebellion or impulse, but out of genuine connection. It wasn't the story the father had expected, but it was the one he needed to hear. When the father finally stepped out of the interrogation room, the girl rushed toward him, searching his face for a sign of what he had decided. He didn't speak immediately, but his expression held a softness she hadn't seen in years, a softness that carried both surrender and acceptance. She watched as he turned toward the window, facing the silent army of bikers, his jaw tightening with emotion. This wasn't a moment of defeat. It was a moment of transformation, the instant a man realized that trust is not a gift earned through force, but through understanding. Outside, the older biker lifted his chin slightly, recognizing the shift even before the doors opened. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation as the father stepped out of the station, his daughter at his side. 200 bikers stood still, watching him with the quiet intensity of men who had been waiting for this decision since dawn. And as he approached the older rider with slow, deliberate steps, the tension in the air poised itself for the turning point that would determine whether this day would end in reconciliation or fracture the town forever. When the father finally stepped forward and extended his hand toward the older biker, a wave of silence swept through the crowd, a silence different from the one that had hovered over the station all morning. This one carried relief, humility, and the quiet recognition that something meaningful had just shifted. The older biker accepted the gesture with steady dignity, and in that simple exchange, both men acknowledged the truth that had taken an entire day of tension to uncover. Respect is earned not through titles, uniforms, or appearances, but through the courage to confront our own assumptions. The bikers relaxed their stance, shoulders softening as the weight of uncertainty lifted from the air. As the father walked toward his daughter, his expression held the honesty of someone who had finally seen the world from a different angle. He admitted, with a voice unsteady yet sincere, that he had been blinded by fear. Fear of losing her, fear of the unknown, fear of what he didn't understand. The young biker stepped forward, not with triumph, but with quiet humility, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. And for the first time, all three stood together not as adversaries, but as people learning to trust one another in a world that too often judges before it listens. The bikers gradually dispersed, engines rumbling to life one by one, each rider leaving with the same calm respect they had shown when they arrived. But the impact of their presence lingered long after the circle dissolved. The townspeople who had watched from the sidelines carried home a story they would tell for years, a story not about fear, but about loyalty, not about confrontation, but about unity, not about division, but about the power of standing for what is right. And perhaps the most significant change happened within the father himself, who realized that love demands courage, and sometimes courage means letting go of the walls we build to keep ourselves safe. As the day came to a close, the young biker and the officer's daughter walked side by side down the quiet street, their steps lightened by the knowledge that they no longer had to fight alone. The father watched from a short distance, still adjusting to the unfamiliar feeling of accepting something he once feared, yet knowing deep inside that this acceptance marked the beginning of a new chapter, for him, for them, and for the community that had witnessed the power of unity in silence. The lesson was clear. Sometimes, the strongest voices are the ones that rise without a single word spoken. And now, if this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your heart to a new perspective, take a moment to stay connected with this journey. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that challenge, uplift, and transform. Leave a like if the message resonated with you, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice completes this narrative and helps it reach others who need to hear it. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may courage guide your steps and compassion shape your view of the world.